It's the show the establishment warned you about.
That's right, it's the Dr. Tommy Show. Welcome. Joining you from the free state of Florida, from Echelon-Health Studios, where we've been since 2013, but not in this same place. Anyway, this is Dr. Tommy, and today I wanted to talk about some Westerns that I've been watching, and Westerns I've seen in the past. I recently finished I call it the Trail Boss Trilogy, which is Robert Duvall starring as a trail boss. It started with Lonesome Dove in 1988, and then he had another turn as a trail boss in this movie called Open Range in 2003, and then after that, there was a mini-series called Broken Trail that was in 2006, and they all starred Robert Duvall as a trail boss. The first time I saw Robert Duvall in a Western, because I watched Robert Duvall when I was a teenager, is The Godfather, Consigliere Tom Hagen. And so the first time I saw him as in a Western was in this movie called Two Mules for Sister Sarah, which also had Clint Eastwood in it. And it was a movie about Clint Eastwood is basically I don't know. He's kind of like a layabout. He's not really anything. He's just this kind of guy that hangs around this town, but he is, he's kind of a lazy guy. And anyway, he gets put in jail. And then once he gets put in jail, he gets rescued from jail because he's got to go find this guy who's this, Mexican bandit, and the guy who wants to hire him to go find this Mexican bandit is Robert Duvall, and his character is after this Mexican bandit. And later on you find out that the Mexican bandit was kind of like a freedom fighter, and then Robert Duvall is maybe a bad guy. So anyway, that's the first time I ever saw Robert Duvall in a Western. But then recently I saw this series called Lonesome Dove, and Lonesome Dove starred Tommy Lee Jones. We talked about this last week, and it also starred Robert Duvall. And Robert Duvall and Tommy Lee Jones are trail bosses, and they're taking these horses that they actually stole, and they stole them. They take some horses and cows, and I think at one point in the movie, Duvall says, I think we stole 90% of these horses, or 9 out of 10 of these horses we stole. Anyway, they stole them from a Mexican bandit who, to be fair, had stolen from them and back and forth. So it was like equal. They weren't just stealing outright. They were stealing back and forth. So that was a movie called Lonesome Dove. It was in 1989, and that was that was broadcast on network television, interestingly enough. And that movie kind of started the Western resurgence. Prior to that, Westerns were old hat. And I think the last time there was I wasn't of age then, so I was a kid, but based on what I can tell, the last time there was a really popular Western that did well was maybe in the 70s. And so Westerns were kind of seen as old hat, and they were boring and kind of like what they call boomer stuff now. You know, it was just old. So Robert Duvall was in that, and Tommy Lee Jones, and they, like I said, they re-energized the Western genre in that show. That show was about these two guys who travel from Texas. Lonesome Dove is a ranch in Texas, and they travel, and they're trying to get to Montana. And along the way, they encounter some trouble, and the guy they encounter, one of the guys' name is Blue Duck. And Blue Duck is a bad guy. Blue Duck is what they call half-breed. So he's half Indian and half white, I think. And Blue Duck's a really bad guy. And Blue Duck basically is the antagonist for them on and off the route amongst other antagonists. And then so that's the first of Duvall as a trail boss. And then later he becomes a trail boss in this movie called Open Range. So Open Range is in 2003, and Open Range is an interesting movie because it's starring Kevin Costner near the height of his fame. Kevin Costner back in the day was I guess in the 90s and into the 2000s, he was a big star. And Kevin Costner actually directed this film, and it starred Robert Duvall. And Costner said, and I've seen this interview, he said that he wasn't going to do the movie unless Duvall agreed to star in it. And he was going to give Duvall top billing because he was out of respect. And so Robert Duvall has top billing. And this movie is read the summary here on IMDb, says, a former gunslinger is forced to take up arms again when he and his cattle crew are threatened by a corrupt landowner. So Costner and Duvall, again, are trail bosses. Well, Duvall's the trail boss and Costner's the lieutenant. And there's two other guys in there. One of the guys is an orphan that they found, and when they found him, we find out later on in the movie, Duvall says that he didn't speak a word of English and he was eating out of a dumpster. So they rescued this guy, and then they have this other guy with him who's he's a helper. I think he's kind of the cook. And if you see these movies, these westerns, there are characters that are involved. So you have a trail boss, and you'll have the cowboys, and then you'll have a cook. And I think this guy was the cook. But anyway, you guys will recognize him if you've seen ER. He was the television show ER. He was the heavy set nurse on ER. I don't even know if he was a nurse. He might have been like here he is right here. He might have been a front desk person or something. If anybody's worked in the ER, the person just sits at the front desk. Anyway, this guy here, let's see if I can blow his picture up. So he was in there, and then so they make their way across the country, and they're trying to get to where they go, and then they run into some trouble with the marshal who is working on behalf of the corrupt landowner who, well, I don't know if he's corrupt. I guess he is corrupt because he basically doesn't want anybody crossing the land and free grazing, as they call it, which was legal, but looked down upon by people like this corrupt landowner. And so that movie goes through its plot and everything, and in the end, all westerns have this familiar, I guess, plot where there's two parties usually, maybe sometimes three, but there's usually, it starts off fairly peaceful, and then there's some altercation, and then there's this kind of confrontation, but the confrontation is going to take place down the line, and the confrontation is going to be a battle, and sometimes it's between good and evil, and sometimes it's just a battle between two people who aren't that good or that evil, and they're going to try to best the other party. But Open Range follows that same format. And later on, we learned that Kevin Costner in this movie is actually a former Civil War. I guess he was special ops. I think he was. He was basically a badass in the Civil War, and he had put that behind him. And he's trying to put that behind him. But as we all know in these movies, sometimes you have to bring your former talents to bear, and he does that. So that's Open Range. Very good movie. Lonesome Dove's a miniseries, Open Range, and then we come to Broken Trail. So Broken Trail was the one that I recently saw, most recent, and it's chronologically the last in the Trail Boss series of Robert Duvall, and he again is a trail boss, and this is a miniseries from 2006. And it stars Thomas Hayden Church, which, if you're familiar with the show Wings, he was in Wings. And he's been in other things. He was in Spider-Man. He's a recurring character in the Spider-Man movies. But Thomas Hayden Church is in this movie, and he's the counterpart to Duvall along their journey. And then this journey, they have Duvall is the uncle of Thomas Hayden Church's character. And Duvall has recently come into some money, and the way he's come into some money is Thomas Hayden Church's character's mother has died, and because she's died, she has left the family ranch to Robert Duvall, and this bothers Robert Duvall because he knows that his nephew is probably the rightful heir. And we learn later on that Thomas Hayden Church is conflicted too because he left the ranch and he left his mother, and there was a kind of a falling out between the two. And then so Duvall has this idea. He says, I'm going to use the ranch. I'm going to mortgage the ranch, and I'm going to mortgage it and then also borrow that money, use that money that I got from the mortgage, and I'm going to buy some horses. And then we're going to take these horses across the country to Oregon, because at the time, this is set around the time of the end of the 1800s, the Spanish-American War was going on, and the British also needed horses for something I can't remember. What war they were doing, I can't remember. But anyway, there was a need for horses, and they were going to take the horses across the country. And as you imagine, they run into trouble. And in this movie, they run into trouble in the form of, let me see if I can remember. Says, a veteran cowboy and his nephew saved 5 Chinese girls from prostitution while trekking from Oregon to Wyoming. So this is another component of Westerns that is often thrown in there. So you have, like I said, you have the trail boss, you have the cook, you have the cowboys, and then oftentimes you have the prostitutes, and a lot of times you have the prostitutes with a heart of gold. And this one has a prostitute with a heart of gold, and she has a very terrible story. So this is similar, very similar to Lonesome Dove, in that the Robert Duvall's character forms a very tight relationship with the prostitute character, and it's seen as kind of a romantic / paternal figure to the prostitute character. Anyway, they trek from, as it says, from Oregon to Wyoming, and when they do that, they run into some trouble, and the trouble has to do with the prostitutes and who has the prostitutes and who the prostitutes are supposed to be delivered to. And the prostitutes are supposed to be delivered to this lady who is basically the boss of this town that has no real authority. And so she runs a prostitution house, and these prostitutes are supposed to be delivered to her, and now she wants to get her prostitutes back. And she's going to employ this guy who just got out of prison, and he's a bad guy, and he's going to go get these prostitutes. And he has a connection to the prostitute that Robert Duvall's character is involved with, kind of. So that's another great, I think it's great. I would call it very good. Let's put it that way. I think Lonesome Dove is great. I think Broken Trail and Open Range are very good. So those are 3 Westerns that are, I call them the Trail Boss, Robert Duvall Trail Boss trilogy. And then Wednesday, Tracy and I went to the Tampa Theater here in Tampa, and we saw this movie called No Country for Old Men, which, as you probably know, is from 2007, so around the same time as Broken Trail and Open Range. And it's considered a modern Western because it doesn't take place in the 1800s like your traditional Western, but it has some of the same plot characteristics. So in this modern Western, they say, violence and mayhem ensue after a hunter stumbles upon an aftermath of a drug deal gone wrong, and over $2 million in cash near the Rio Grande. And this is what I would call a great movie. And it stars Tommy Lee Jones again. So here's a tie-in. All these things tie together. So Lonesome Dove ties into No Country for Old Men because Tommy Lee Jones is in it, and it's a Western. And this movie also stars Javier Bardem, which probably is one of the greatest characters in cinematic history. I'm going to show this next week because I'm getting the new computer, and this computer is going to be a real streaming powerhouse, because right now I'm running off of a 2018 Mac Mini, but I'm getting a brand new Mac Mini. So anyway, I can't show the trailer right now because it'll bog down the feed, but I'll show you this next week. But No Country for Old Men has Javier Bardem in it, and also Josh Brolin, and who is the son of Mr. Barbra Streisand. And this movie is, like I said, it's a great movie. It starts off, like I say, Hunter stumbles across a drug deal gone wrong. I actually read this book. I didn't read the book. I listened to the audio book, and it's by this guy called Cormac McCarthy. I think his first name is Cormac, and he wrote the movie called wrote the book called No Country for Old Men. There it is, Cormac McCarthy, and that book was made into this movie. The book expands a little bit on the character of Javier Bardem, which is named Chigurh. Expands on him a little bit more. It does also do some more exposition. In the movie, you notice Tommy Lee Jones is basically like a narrator. And the movie follows, although Josh Brolin's the main character from a protagonist standpoint, Tommy Lee Jones is basically the narrator of the movie. He's the one, we're in his conscience throughout the movie from the beginning to end. And so the book expands upon that a little bit more, and there's these expositions where there will be in the movie, Tommy Lee Jones is talking over a scene, and he's describing something in his life, but it's not related to the scene necessarily. So we learn a little bit more about his character in that book. And also in the book, this movie also explains a little bit more. I'm sorry, this book explains a little bit more about the movie, because in the movie it's not really clear what's going on. There's three parties. And so you have Josh Brolin, who's this kind of guy, accidentally finds this money, and then you have Chigurh, which is Javier Bardem, and he is the one that was hired to go find the money. And then you have some Mexicans who are the ones who are out the heroin. So there's a heroin deal that goes down. They call it Mexican brown dope in the movie, but it's heroin. And so I believe it's the Mexicans were bringing the heroin, and then there were some people going there to buy the heroin, and that's when things happen. And so the Mexicans are involved in the book more, and you see that related, how there's like three parties. It's kind of like in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. There's three parties. There's Clint Eastwood. There is oh shoot, now I'm gonna have to look it up. But anyway, you have three parties in The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. And so that's kind of similar in the book. You learn that there's more than just Brolin versus Javier Bardem. It's Brolin versus Javier Bardem versus the Mexicans, who don't have a name. They're just called, in the book, Mexicans. But anyway, that movie is a great movie. That movie is great. It ends, when we saw it in the Tampa Theater, the way it ends, it's basically people just sit there and they're like, oh my gosh, it's over. Or is it over? Or it's one of those movies. There's no like, riding off into the sunset or celebration or anything. It just kind of ends. And some people hate those type of endings. It's not a surprise ending, but there's no real resolution. You have to kind of think about it on your own and figure out what it means and this, that, and the other. All these movies are different than movies that are made today. Movies made today are so, I guess the worst example is Netflix movies. No offense to anybody out there who loves Netflix movies, but Netflix movies are in my mind, the most simplistic form of movie making that's can be even imagined. Paper thin characters, paper thin production, plot lines that are entirely predictable, and then quality of the screenplay is usually, just. I won't watch one almost by rule. But anyway, these movies are great. No Country for Old Men, Lonesome Dove, Open Range, Broken Trail. Now, so what's the next movie? So the next thing I want to talk about is Deadwood. Deadwood was called, what did they call it when it came out? I don't know if they called it they used the word, what do they say? They're so common now that this is a typical Western, but they used to call revisionist Western. So back in the day, before I was born, in the 60s, the Westerns were black hat versus white hat. It was really clear who was the bad guy, who was the good guy. And then around in the spaghetti Westerns is when they started doing what they call revisionist Westerns. And revisionist Westerns meant that there was no clear-cut good guy and bad guy. And I guess that's been around so long that I kind of don't even call things revisionist Westerns anymore. But they call Deadwood a revisionist Western because... here's a good way of thinking about it. In the 70s, Clint Eastwood, actually, John Wayne wrote a letter to Clint Eastwood, and I think this is after he made High Plains Drifter. And he criticized Clint Eastwood for his choice of movies in the Western genre, because John Wayne was of the Western for the most part, although True Grit was kind of not this way, but John Wayne was of the Western for the most part, where the people in the West were honest and pious, God-fearing people, salt of the earth, and there were good guys and there were bad guys, and the good guys should win. Well, Clint Eastwood came into town in the spaghetti westerns along with other people, and Sergio Leone is a director, and Eli Wallach was who I was thinking about in the earlier on Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But so, you know, the revisionist western now is kind of so common that I don't even call them revisionist western, but Deadwood's called a revisionist western. And back to the John Wayne thing. So John Wayne wrote a letter to Clint Eastwood, and he said, look, you know, these movies you're making aren't accurate depictions of the West. The West was, the people were nice, the people were good, and you really shouldn't be, you know, making these movies that depict the people as being callous and maybe self-centered and maybe not necessarily good people. And in Deadwood, it carries on that tradition. And the people of Deadwood a lot of people are very bad. And one of the people that's probably very bad is Al Swearingen, which if you look at this IMDb, here's Al Swearingen here. So Al Swearingen's the guy who owns the saloon, and also has Powers Booth in it. And it also has Timothy Oliphant. And Ian McShane plays Al Swearingen. Ian McShane is tremendous in this. And if it wasn't for his character, this movie or this show, I think, probably would not have been as good. I mean, there were some other people I read about who they were considering it, but the producers of Deadwood wanted someone who was not well known, because they wanted this character to be the embodiment of himself rather than the character. Sometimes you see characters in movies, and like, for instance, Al Pacino comes to mind. Anytime you see Al Pacino in a movie, you can't think of anything other than that's Al Pacino playing a character. But in this show, Deadwood series, Ian McShane embodies Al Swearingen. And if Al Swearingen ever lived, and he did live, he was an actual historical figure, he may not have been anything like Ian McShane's characterization of him, but in my mind, that is Al Swearingen. And the show ran for 3 seasons. So it was 3 seasons in the mid 2000s. It says here 2004 to 2006. And during that time, what happened was David Milch, who was a creator, wanted to make a show about a civilization. He wanted to make a show about how a town becomes civilized, essentially. And in the beginning, he wanted to set it in Rome. He wanted to be about ancient Rome. And then he found out, well, gee whiz, HBO has just recently signed up a show to be made called Rome. Well, that went his idea. So I'm not sure who recommended it. Maybe it was himself or the producers, but they said, well, why don't you make it into the Old West? And Deadwood was born. Deadwood is in South Dakota, and it's a town. And basically at the beginning of the series, Timothy Oliphant's character is a marshal in an adjacent town. And he's basically he's leaving town on his own because he's tired of being a marshal. And there's a guy he has in his jail cell who is wanted by the local townspeople because they want to do vigilante justice on him. And he, being the marshal, does not want to do vigilante justice, doesn't want them to do vigilante justice. And he's here between this bad guy, probably, we don't know what he did, and these vigilantes. And here he is trying to stop it and putting his life in peril. And he's just thinking, you know what, I've had enough of this stuff. So anyway, that resolves. He gets out of town. He arrives in Deadwood, and Deadwood is basically a camp, is what they call it. It's a camp. And it's got a few, roughshod buildings. There's some people building some buildings. The saloon's there, so definitely there's some buildings there. But it's not a town in the way you would think of a town that has, established sheriff and a mayor and everything. And throughout the series, those things happen. And at the end of the series, which occurs as a movie, in And the end of the series, so the series ran from 2004 to 2006, and then ends abruptly. So what happened was David Milch had a falling out with the producers. And the reason why, according to what I've read, is that David Milch was always difficult to work with. And that's part of, I guess, being a creative and maybe creative genius, is that a lot of those people are hard to work with and they don't like to be constrained. And I guess Milch, maybe pushed the envelope a little too much with the producers, and there were cost overruns. And what happened was Milch basically was unceremoniously, his show was unceremoniously ended. So they had no advance warning that the last season would be the last season. And the last season ends in basically a cliffhanger. I don't want to spoil anything, but basically what happens is there's a bad guy, who comes to town, and his character is played by what's his name? His character is played by I'll find it here. All casting crew. So anyway, so that show ends on a cliffhanger, and it wasn't until 10 years later, actually, that they finished the show. They finished the show with a movie, and the movie came out in 2019. It was called Deadwood, the movie. And that movie finished the show. And in that movie, the town of Deadwood is celebrating being accepted into the state. Because before that, they were just outlying territory. And that's an ongoing problem throughout the movie, or throughout the series, is that the people don't want to become, some people don't want to become part of the state because they want to remain as outlaws, kind of on the outskirts of law, let's put it that way. And they want to maintain their independence. And then there's some people who want to join and be part of it. And so when season 3 ended, there was no resolution, but that resolution, there was finally a partial resolution in the Deadwood movie, which took place 10 years later after the production, roughly. It actually took place about 12 years later. But in the movie chronology, it takes place 10 years later. So it's Gerald McCraney, who plays George Hearst, who is the grandfather of Hearst, who became the famous publisher. So Gerald McCraney, at the end of season 3, rides out of town having done some bad things, and it's really up in the air about what happened. I don't want you to be dissuaded from watching that, because a lot of times when you hear about a movie or a show that didn't end properly, you don't ever want to invest your time in it, because then you're like, well, it didn't end properly. I don't want to see it. These are movies or shows that get cut off. But although Deadwood was cut off, they did have an ending, and it probably would be better if they had been spread out over a season, because it kind of had to be crammed into one movie. But either way, it had a resolution. So watch Deadwood and watch Deadwood the movie. Deadwood, to me, did to the Western for series or for a genre what Sopranos did for the mafia movies, and that it revitalized it, and it revitalized it in a way that was fresh, and also I don't want to say revolutionary, because that's a little too strong, but it revitalized it in a way that I say caused a resurgence. Let's put it that way, because after Deadwood, you did have some more of these Westerns now being made, which I don't know if they would have been made if it hadn't been for Deadwood. So some of these Westerns that are coming out, and a lot of them are modern Westerns, like maybe Broken Trail, although it was kind of contemporary to Deadwood. Broken Trail came out in 2006, and Deadwood ended in 2006. You could say it was influenced potentially by it. Interestingly, Broken Trail, back to being Deadwood, this is another tie-in, so all these things tie together. Broken Trail was directed by Walter Hill. And Walter Hill was a director who was fairly well known. And he was a director who was the one that directed the pilot of Deadwood. So the pilot episode of Deadwood was directed by Walter Hill. And Walter Hill and David Milch had a falling out after after the first episode, and Walter Hill was no longer involved in that. And when this first movie first came, or this series first came out, that was a big, one of the big things going around in the press is like, oh, Walter Hill's involved. And so Walter Hill then was not involved, but the series continued and continued to be continued successfully. So Deadwood did for the Western, I think, what Sopranos did for Mafia. Mafia movies after, the Mafia genre after the Sopranos, I think there was a resurgence because right now there's Mafia movies out there. So Boardwalk Empire came right on the heels of Sopranos. Boardwalk Empire was actually started by the showrunner was one of the writers and directors of Sopranos episodes, and so that was kind of a gangster. I don't call it mafia, but the mafia is involved certainly. I haven't even seen Boardwalk Empire, so that's one of the things on my to-do list at some point to watch Boardwalk Empire. But anyway, Boardwalk Empire came after that, and then there's currently a series on TV called Mobland, and Mobland is Irish mob, not Italian, and it's contemporary, and it stars Pierce Brosnan. He's the head honcho, and it is I guess that's a resurgence of the mobster genre. And then now we run into the last movie or series I want to talk about. It's called Hatfields and McCoys. Just started this one. This one's called Hatfields and McCoys. It is tied into the other stuff because Kevin Costner's involved in this one. This came out in 2012, miniseries on AMC, actually History Channel. And it says it's a dramatization of the bitter feud between two families on the West Virginia-Kentucky border in the years after the Civil War. So when I was a kid, we always learned about the Hatfields and McCoys, and the way we learned about them, I learned about them through cartoons. And the cartoon characters were Hatfields and McCoys. But I have not read that much about it. I'm going to wait till afterwards to read about the actual history of it. But this movie I just started, our series, we just started. It's 3 episodes, 2 hours apiece. We have watched one of the episodes. And like I said, it has Kevin Costner starring in it. He's not a director in this show, but he is starring in it. So that's how it ties in. All these movies are fairly, I'd consider them on the scale of brutal to not brutal. They are on the brutal scale. Certainly No Country for Old Men is brutal. Lonesome Dove, even being on a network television in the early 80s, as limited as you would have thought the violence could have been back then, was very, I think, borderline rated R. But it was on TV apparently, and I didn't see it then. I didn't see it till recently, like I said. But Lonesome Dove was not as brutal as No Country for Old Men or Deadwood. Certainly didn't have vulgarity in it as Deadwood. The Deadwood, if you are watching Deadwood and you're sensitive to dirty language, don't watch that. It set a world record for the F word, apparently, in the first episode, the pilot episode. And so don't watch that if you are sensitive to that or that offends you. So Deadwood has vulgarity in it. So Hatfields and McCoys, just started that. It seems to be, like I said, on the brutal index, more towards the brutal side. And then Broken Trail and Open Range. So none of these are like movies that you probably want to watch with little kids. Well, that's it for today. Join us next time. Dr. Tommy's show streams on Rumble. It is streaming on audio. And next time you see me, you will have a different experience because the video feed will be running because I'll have a brand new computer that will stream like nobody's business. But thank you for joining us. Until next time, bye-bye.